The Drew Writing Project and Digital Literacies Collaborative of Drew University in Madison, New Jersey is proud to present a series of webinars on the ethics of digital literacy. This video is the kickoff lecture presented by Dr. Kristen Hawley-Turner, editor of the book, The Ethics of Digital Literacy, Developing Knowledge and Skills Across Grade Levels.
I want to thank everyone at the Drew Writing Project and Digital Literacies Collaborative and Drew Teach for all of the effort that they put in, and for all of the teachers who are here in the room. I want to thank you for all that you do for children. And for those of you that have come from very far away to be here tonight, I want to thank you just for supporting what we're doing here at Drew and supporting the work that we're doing, particularly in digital literacies. So ethical dimensions of teaching digital literacy is something that evolved out of a conversation that I had with someone I didn't know, actually. Dom Sabilla, who is affiliated with Drew through his brother, actually, came into my office about 2 years ago and said, "Hey, I heard you're a teacher, and I care deeply about the teaching of ethics, and I'm putting together this series of books on ethics, and I'd really like you to be involved." And I kind of went, okay, this sounds interesting. I care deeply about ethics, you know, like that sounds like a good thing to care deeply about. But he asked me to write a book about middle school, which I know a lot about, but when I thought about teaching ethics in middle school, I wasn't really sure I could write that book well or edit that book well. And I said, you know what I do know a lot about is digital literacy. And it seems to me we are living in an age where ethics and digital spaces really need a lot of thinking surrounding them. So I'd be willing to work on that book. But I can't do it myself. It's not something that I have all of the expertise in, but I do have a great network of teachers who are doing great things in their classroom. So I want to make this a collaborative effort. So I started out on a personal inquiry that turned into a huge collaborative effort. And we had to start first, let's see if I can move this out of the way, by defining the two words that are in the title of this book, ethics and digital literacy. How many of you have ever tried to define digital literacy? Okay, so some of you have thought about it. Has anyone ever Googled it to try to get a definition? Is there a definition? No, it seems like this very amorphous concept that depending on where you're coming from, what discipline you're looking at it from, you have a different conception of what digital literacy is. Well, I felt like I had done a lot of studying and a lot of reading and a lot of talking with people who know a lot in the field of digital and in the field of literacy that I could present a definition. So the definition for digital literacy that I shared in the book is digital literacy is the knowledge and skills that allow for critical consumption, creation, interaction, and communication using digital technologies. So digital literacy is basically taking literacy, which we think of in terms of reading and writing and communicating, and layering over that digital piece, because we do a lot of our interaction with people through digital technologies. So consumption is the equivalent of reading. Creation is the equivalent of writing. But these things happen not just with alphabetic text in a digital world. We have multimodal opportunities to create, to consume, to interact, and to communicate. So that's the definition of digital literacy. I felt really comfortable with that. Pretty good. Then I had to define ethics. I wasn't sure where I was going with ethics, so I did what most people do. I went to the internet. Google says that ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And then if you just kind of scroll down or scan down that list of Google search results, you'll see phrases like dealing with what is good and bad, right and wrong. Okay, so I'm getting the idea that ethics has to do with behavior, morality, good, bad, right, and wrong. What does that mean when we put it together with digital literacy? So this was the big question I have. As with any big question I have, I activated the PLN, Personal Learning Network, through email, through Facebook connections, through Twitter, through texting my colleagues across the nation, across the world, through talking with people face to face, Then through word of mouth, as they were kind of spreading out to their PLNs, I was able to start gathering ideas from all kinds of teachers and researchers about what ethics and digital literacy might look like. So all of these people are represented in this book because they shared with me, here's how I'm teaching ethics of digital literacy. Here's how I'm thinking about the ethics of digital literacy. And as I collected their ideas, I started to notice that Lauren, and you can't see her, she's covered under my Zoom thing, and Amelia and Derek, they were falling into a certain category where they were really looking at the context in which their students lived. And then other people, Sue and Tom, Andrea and Lee, were looking at selves or identity. And then other people were looking at the communities that we form online. And as I looked through all of the responses from my personal learning network, I realized that I could put things into about 5 buckets. And these buckets were contexts, selves, communities, stances, and practices. So these 5 buckets became to me what I consider the 5 dimensions of teaching the ethics of digital literacy. You start with the context in which our students live or in which we live. And then you move into thinking about identities and how we are performing identities in digital spaces and perhaps in analog spaces. And then the communities that we are forming in digital spaces. Stances takes a stance, or it's not just about the performance, but that we are being intentional about how we act in these spaces, and even more intentional in how we teach our students to act in these spaces. And then finally, the 5th category of practices are those things that we are actually doing. So let's go through these one at a time. We're going to start with ethical contexts. Coming around to you are these 3 ethical contexts, and if you are online, you can just read them in the Zoom and perhaps chat with each other. There's context A, the school is one-to-one, and that means that every student in the school is provided with a digital device. And in this particular school, every student has a Chromebook. Wireless is ubiquitous and reliable on school property. Inappropriate content and social media sites are blocked. Most of the students also have access to the internet at home and own personal devices. About 5% of the student body qualifies for free or reduced lunch. Most of those students access the internet at the local library during after-school hours. So that's our first context, context A. Context B, the school has laptop carts and 2 computer labs and limits bring your own devices to the purview of individual teachers who must request permission and justify the need to their administrators. Nearly every student has a smartphone and uses publicly available Wi-Fi outside of school to save on data charges. Laptops and labs are used primarily for testing. That's context B. And by the way, all 3 of these contexts are real schools that I have worked in. Context C, the school provides every student with a Gmail address and access to Google Apps. YouTube and Blogger are not enabled, and students cannot send nor receive emails from outside the school domain. Teachers use Google Classroom to post classwork and assignments, and students use Docs for paragraph and essay writing almost daily. Okay, we have 3 contexts, and what I would like you to do is turn and talk with the person next to you and decide which context is the most unethical. The most unethical. Okay, how many people have an answer? That's a good inquiry question, right? How many people want to share? Does anyone want to share what you were thinking as you were trying to come to an answer about the most unethical?
We were saying, like, in the last part of the conversation, we were talking about option B, because what's happening to us in this school is that all the students have access to a device, right? They all have a smartphone, so they have some digital literacy. but it's not being taught or it's not being kind of utilized in the school by the teachers if all they're using the public resources for are testing. So those laptops and those labs are just used for one thing. The students we know have devices that can access the internet, can talk, electronically, but we're not focusing on that. We're kind of like putting them into two separate boxes.
Interesting.
I mean, I think it kind of depends on what ethical dilemma you're looking at. I mean, if you're talking about access and equity, that's one issue. If you're talking about instruction or how instruction is being done, teaching to the test or whatnot, I mean, I think there's a lot of different things going on here, moving parts. So I don't know. I mean, if you're talking about access and equity, I would say, probably C is the worst. But if you're talking about access to information or sort of open ideas rather than sort of pipelined ideas through teacher-centered instruction, I think that's a different issue.
So access and equity versus access to information, okay?
I think my initial reaction was D. That was the one I feel like rattled my chains the most, in that it felt very much like you had to justify your need for something. And therefore, it wasn't like you weren't prioritizing students' needs as much. Like, well, this one is more important to this one, so you guys can't get the Chromebook card because we have to excuse it to somebody else. And that just felt very, it didn't promote like a good learning culture.
And it's interesting that you said Chromebooks and it's actually laptops, which are two different sets of devices. And in some ways, two different ways of accessing information, equity and access in terms of the kind of device that's available. Any other thoughts?
We were looking at it from the two definitions that you explained for ethics and then the other one for digital literacy. And we said we also chose B because the students are not using the technology to consume anything, to create anything, or to communicate, and therefore they're not learning the ethics about how to do any of those three things.
Are the students in scenario C doing any of those things?
Not according to the definition, no. A is tough though, because there's 5% of the student body that can't do things that the rest of the student body can do.
Say more about that.
So 5% of the student body might have a Chromebook, but they might not be able to do most of the things that you're supposed to be able to do on a Chromebook once they get home, unless they can get to the library, but who knows if they can get to the library.
And there are certain limits on what can be done on school grounds where they do have ubiquitous access.
We also are talking about that because in the definition of A, it keeps saying that most of the students have this and most of those students have that. So we're saying, well, what about the other students that aren't included in the most?
Right. These are all really important things to consider. It's not just about a school providing one-to-one access, right? And I think you've brought up a lot of great things. So the access to the device or the access to the internet at school is one thing, but then who has that access when they go home? And what kind of access is actually happening on school property? So in the Ethics of Digital Literacy book, Nicole Mira is the first researcher that offers a meditation. Throughout the book, there are 5 meditations from leading researchers in the field. And she says, what does it say about the conceptions of technology and of young people when students are applauded for using Google Classroom, but criticized for sharing media on Snapchat and YouTube? Are students being prepared to fully leverage the affordances of technology in all aspects of their lives if they are sheltered from engaging with a public beyond their classroom? So in that C scenario, where YouTube and Blogger are disabled, there are certain creative opportunities that students do not have. And what does it say that as a school, we are not valuing those creative opportunities, but perhaps valuing writing on a Google Doc? Are these ethical questions that we should be considering as teachers and administrators and school leaders? I had the great fortune to talk with Chris Gilliard the other day for the Technopanic podcast, and that episode will be out very soon, and I really encourage you to listen to it because Chris has done research on community college programs, and he writes about the fact that he works in a community college, and his college had an acceptable use policy and limits on what students could access while in the system. So this sounds very familiar to our K-12 public schools, right? That schools, and actually by law, must filter some of the content that comes into their domains. Somebody has to make the choice about what is filtered. And so schools vary in the apps that they allow, in the websites that they allow their students to access. And Chris argues, if students are filtered, then it might not be an ethical situation. So particularly at the community college level, if students are filtered from accessing sources, and community colleges typically can't invest in library sources that perhaps other four-year institutions can, and then they are putting what he calls invisible walls around the internet that they can access, that's problematic. So he asked really important and interesting questions. He also talks a lot about privacy and how he is no longer on social media, and you'll notice, or on Facebook, I'm sorry, and he doesn't even have his picture here. And when I interviewed him, he didn't even have his video going. So very interesting episode of the Technopanic podcast for you to listen to if you're interested in these kinds of things. When you're thinking about ethical context, I encourage you to ask these questions that Chris was asking. Who has access is, of course, something that we're always thinking about. I did some research with Troy Hicks a couple of years ago where we uncovered that even in schools that were kind of like School B, where there weren't a lot of resources, 100% of the students had access to the internet. A lot of them were accessing through smartphones, through Wi-Fi, through public Wi-Fi. So what kind of access is it that they have? And these are questions you might want to ask your students. What kind of access do you have? How are you accessing internet? Is it at home? Is it at school? What kinds of devices do you have? This will help you to understand the context that they come from. Also, how good is that access? And how is the access regulated? Are there any invisible walls around the access to information, consumption, and creation that they have? These are the questions that you want to think about to build ethical context. So that takes us to ethical selves. We're going to start looking at identities and who we are online. So I'm going to ask you to search yourself. Better yet, if you're willing, ask the person sitting next to you to search you. And the reason that I ask this is because they are going to have different filters on their phone than you are. So it'll be interesting to see what comes up on somebody else's browser. So just Google yourself, DuckDuckGo yourself, Yahoo yourself, that still exists. So we talk a lot in teacher education about having that professional persona versus the personal persona, particularly for younger teachers who actually had social media in their younger days and have a more personal persona online. But here's what I want you to ask yourself right now. Take a look at those search results, either of your colleague or yourself, and ask, where are you a learner? Like if your students Googled you, and I guarantee you they do, where are you showing yourself as a learner in the world to your students? Where do you provide a responsive and responsible voice in your interactions and content? Where do you advocate for underrepresented groups of students? So go ahead and take a look at those search results and see if anything about you speaks to one of these questions. Anything that you want to share with the group? Any revelations, thoughts, ideas?
I thought I changed all of my names on social media, so I need to change to Pinterest. I just put like my middle name. But I was happy to say that most of my stuff was about soccer, and also a lot of assignments I've done here at Drew that was like some YouTube videos for like blended learning and stuff like that. So it seems to be pretty positive.
So you're a learner?
So I would say, yeah, Drew is definitely on there.
I looked up Kelly, and aside from finding her Instagram, which she needs to change, well, it's on private, so it's linked to that. But I found an article from Drew about the Rise Summit, right? Was that what it was? Yeah, it was a Teach for America thing, which was cool to see.
Cool. Anything else?
The first thing that was given for me, the only thing that actually had my face in it besides Etsy, which I'm changing, was LinkedIn, that's the word. LinkedIn, first thing.
Is it a bad thing, though, for our picture to be in there? Like, my picture comes up a lot in Google, but it's all linked to positive things, like newspaper articles. And I don't know, I don't see anything negative about it, but is that wrong?
So you've just brought in the words from that ethics slide, right? Wrong, bad versus good, right. And these are questions that we need to grapple with. And what is the ethics of having a public persona? So Sarah Cater, the researcher who reflects on the dimension of self, says that teachers who pull themselves offline are actually doing their students a disservice. That it is an ethical imperative for teachers to be models of how to present themselves ethically online. So she poses these questions about where are you showing yourself as a learner? Where do you provide a responsive and responsible voice in interactions and content? And where do you advocate for underrepresented groups of students? Where are you being a model citizen, in other words, showing an identity that is a model? So I'm not going to answer your question because I think that's something that you need to reflect on. And as Chris Gilliard has decided, he said you can find images of him online, but he didn't put them there. That's his choice. That doesn't mean that's everybody's choice. But to think intentionally about that is something that you want to do. Basically, I'm suggesting that you be reflective, search yourselves. Rather occasionally, you might find things you didn't expect to see. Be critical in what you're posting and what you're creating and what you're putting out there, and be intentional about your digital media use. You are an identity, both online and offline, and you need to curate that identity so it is the identity that is you and that you want to put out to the world. That takes us to ethical communities. So we started with context in which we live, the selves that we are presenting, and the communities in which we reside comes next. So here's a quote from the researcher meditation for this section. Many people have more in common with individuals who live across an internet connection than they do with the person who lives next door. Turn and talk. What do you think about that? All right, thoughts? Agree, disagree? Personal experience?
I mean, I'd agree with that, but I think there's an issue there with confirmation bias. I mean, I think that's one of the big ethical problems that comes out of that, is that we tend to develop communities where we think alike or we agree on things rather than sort of confronting differences and dealing with that. So, I mean, I think it's true. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. I think it could be a dangerous thing.
Right, so this issue of confirmation bias, meaning that we look for evidence that supports, or people that support what we already believe, rather than listening to discordant thoughts and taking them in and reshaping our beliefs, can become an ethical problem, or perhaps already is.
Me and Alex talked about how there's definitely two sides to that. So on one side, finding people you have something in common with, if you live in a community where you've not been welcomed and where your neighbors aren't people that are willing to get to know you, might be is a place that people can go to, that it is either safe or that it is somewhere where they're accepted, more welcoming.
And then on the flip side, like, I feel like in the age we live in today, a lot of people put more time into internet friends versus going next door and spending time with someone who's like not your demographic. Like, elderly people or an adult or children, and getting out into the community and finding those connections, because it's really about the amount of time you input, and that's how you become closer. Like with our students, like the more time you spend with them, the more like on that building that relationship, the more that that trust and that likableness develops. So it's where you put your
We
time.
also talked about how you're more likely to cherry pick people. If you meet them on the internet, you can really search the confirmation bias. You can find someone just like you.
You can find a lot of people not like you on the internet too. We just tend not to, I think, right? So Ian, who is the author that wrote that, that's Ian. And I met Ian through a mutual colleague. I was working on a piece for pediatrics on digital media literacy, and I had a lot of colleagues from the media literacy world already working on my team, and I needed some more from the digital literacy world. And we could have another conversation some other time about why that's two different worlds. Our goal was to kind of bring these worlds together. And one of my other collaborators, Troy Hicks, said, you need to talk to Ian O'Byrne. So Ian came in on that project. He worked on this team with me. We published something together. It took about 18 months. And after that publication, we kept talking because that publication was for Pediatrics, a journal about doctors who work with children. So we started thinking about our own children. We're both parents of younger children, saying that, this issue of screen time is really concerning to me, but the big narrative around it is so negative, and screens are not all negative. We just have to be more intentional. So what do we need to learn here? So he and I started this project called the ScreenTime.me project. He picked the website, not me. I don't know why it's a .me. But Living and Learning in the Age of Screen Time turned into a research project that's still up there, and it's Flipgrid, where you can go in and answer questions about screen time and ask questions about screen time. And then we started answering these questions that people were asking and thinking more about these definitions and talking about our own kids. And we said, you know what, we're just talking to each other all the time. Like, let's just do a podcast. So now we've hosted this podcast. And we worked together for over 3 years before we ever met face to face at a conference where we had submitted a proposal. We walk across the room, we give each other hugs, like we're good friends now because we've been working together so long in a digital space. The Screen Time Age then has added 2 more collaborators on our research team, Katie and Elizabeth, who I've been now working with for well over a year, and I've never met face to face, but I feel like I know them and I know their kids, and the community is actually expanding now. So what started out as just one-on-one collaboration has now become a whole digital community where for the most part we only know each other online. That's a very different community than Gluten Free in New Jersey, which I am also a member of, and I have a lot more in common with the people in Gluten Free in New Jersey than I do with a lot of my neighbors in my neighborhood, although I like my neighbors. I'm not saying that I don't like my neighbors, but I talk more sometimes with the people in this group because we have certain problems that we want to solve. Another online community, very different than DeviantArt, who a senior taught me about, and Pottermore, which has, I just found out, now become the Wizarding World, which is a space where a lot of youth congregate for fan fiction purposes. The reason that I bring this up is because what Ian pushes us to do in his meditation is to think about the norms and practices of the community and what makes a good and productive citizen in that community. So it's very different to be a good and productive citizen in a research community for ScreenTime.me, and your contributions there need to be very different to be a good citizen than in Gluten Free New Jersey. And both of those are very different than DeviantArt and Wizarding World, Pottermore. But really what I want you to think about is that digital citizenship is more than just using the internet safely and responsibly, which is what you will find as the definition of digital citizenship if you look online. And it's probably the definition that your schools are looking through a lens at. Being a part of a community means that you learn the norms and practices, you help develop them, you advocate when necessary. It's not just about shutting down things because they might be unsafe or developing that perfect digital footprint. once you have figured out how to create that ethical community, you can start thinking about the stances that you want to take. And in this book, we recommend that teachers take particular stances in order that their students can take particular stances. I want to ask you, what does it look like for your students to be participating in your class? Go ahead, turn and talk. What does that look like? How do you know? Okay, a couple quick ideas. What does it look like? How do you know that they are participating? How do you know your students are participating in your class? Like, I know because you guys are all talking right now, right?
For me, I know because they have, their voices will be put out to the world.
So you can hear their voices.
Yeah.
Active listening, are they demonstrating, that they're engaged with, the teacher speaking or their peers speaking?
Okay.
I look for non-verbal cues, so sometimes it's better to jot down notes or nodding along and take out.
Okay.
We talked a little bit about in digital spaces, do students treat it like a conversation, or do they more just like post their thoughts and walk away? Is there like an ongoing dialogue that they're engaged in?
So do you count the just posting as participation?
Not to the, like it wouldn't be considered an A, because I think then that digital space, that discussion that you're having online is a little more than like a published essay of some, like there's an interactive component, and that's part of what we're after by having those spaces.
So I'm hearing similar things, like you want voice and you want conversation, which is different than behavioral cues, right? That you can see people raising their hands, right? That's the traditional form of participation. My students participate by raising their hands and then they say something, right? That's not exactly what Troy is talking about when he talks about participation as a stance. He says that participation requires both critical consumption, and that word critical is important, right? It's not just consuming, like you're scrolling, but that you are critically consuming the things that are in your digital space. And you are creating. So there's a couple of layers there. That critical piece is the first layer. But the second layer is you can't just consume. You can't just read, you need to write. So you can't just consume, you need to create in order to participate. And participation works hand in hand with this concept of agency, which is another one of those words that can be defined in a million different ways. So we owned it as a team and said that agency is really about the ability to direct your own learning, to use your participation for advocacy and engagement in society, to give that agency to a learner. It's not just about picking this book or that book, right? It's not just about choice, but it's really about thinking about how to use participation to engage in society. So when I think about participation and agency working hand in hand, I think about projects like the KQED Youth Media Challenge, and they just launched their teacher resources yesterday. So any of you who are currently in the classroom, this is something that you can get on board with right now. It's about Election 2020. This builds on Letters to the Next President, which happened in 2016. Letters to the Next President obviously was letters, but digital media has changed so much in the landscape and the possibilities that National Writing Project, in partnership with KQED and Public Radio, has said we're going to look at media and we're going to publish kids' voices in the media on issues that matter to them. Okay, so when you hear that KQED Media Challenge, did you get the idea that students can research and then create media that will be submitted to KQED, and they will be selecting student media to air on public radio and public broadcasting networks. So when you think about that kind of opportunity in terms of participation as defined here by Troy and agency as we discussed, what do you see in that possibility? You can go ahead and turn and talk, or maybe other possibilities. So in the book, Troy recommends that you take a stance of participation and agency, not just use those words saying, oh, I encourage participation, or I give my students agency, or I build agency, but that you really want to look at those two things together to do something more than what's happening in your classroom. And whether it's something like the KQED Media Challenge or another challenge that you present to your students, think about them as stances, because taking those stances is ethical, and it's an ethical imperative to give your students real world learning. That takes us to our last dimension of ethical practices. And this one, like some of the other dimensions that we were looking at, are amorphous, right? They're kind of out there, they're hard to define. Practices are really the skills. They're things you can measure, they're things that you can kind of see. And I'm going to give you a quiz because of that, okay? So you can just write down your answers on a sheet of paper. That's not very digital. You could tweet them if you wanted to. So here's your quiz. I can use someone else's words as my own. I can cut and paste from a website onto this slide. I can use Google image search to find the perfect picture to use in my presentation. I can use my favorite song as a backdrop for my presentation. Maybe I should have used the word may in here. I may use, yeah, because you can do these, may. It's not a skill. I'm asking, are you allowed to do these things? Okay, so if we go back to our questions, do you want to change any of your answers? These are kind of trick questions, right? Because it's not all black and white. The problem is a lot of people don't realize that, particularly our younger students, although I would say my graduate students have just as hard a time as the elementary students that I work with in understanding what you are permitted to use and what you don't. I was very fortunate to work with Renee Hobbs, who has written many books in digital and media literacies, and she wrote this that I consider my little copyright clarity Bible. We have some of these out there if anybody needs to understand copyright clarity and what you are permitted and are not permitted to do as a teacher, and what your students can do and how you can help them to understand issues of copyright. But that's not what I want to talk about, because that's not really the ethical dimension that she talks about in the ethics of digital literacy. She kind of assumes that you've read copyright clarity and know like what copyright and fair use is. But she said what happens is that repackaging content for digital platforms raises ethical issues when it obscures authorship. So when you think about curating things, like we're making nice little websites where we're pulling resources for our students, but we don't actually link back to the original resource, so it becomes link after link after link. And she gave an example where she found someone basically sharing work that Renee had written and posted for people to use, but it didn't look like Renee's work because it had been repurposed so many times that you couldn't trace it back to the owner. So that's an ethical dilemma in the practices of using and sharing, even when that work is meant to be shared. And she raises a couple other ethical issues in terms of practices. But just what are you allowed to copy and paste? What do you need to cite? How do you need to cite it? These are questions that we might not have answered in the same way in teaching plagiarism and citation practices in print-based texts that we need to think about as in terms of ethical practices. I've started this work with even the very youngest students. I was in a 3rd grade classroom I've also done a similar lesson in a middle school classroom and in an adult professional development workshop, where I just start by stealing somebody's work. You know, usually when you're in a classroom, there's work around. So I just steal it, kind of like this beautiful picture. I wanted to share it with you and tell you, you know, I painted this. Isn't it great? You like it, right? I did paint this picture, but that one wasn't mine. That one's mine. But the teacher said, yeah, you could take a picture of my picture and use it for your presentations and things like that. So I had permission to use it, but nowhere is it cited, right? But when I do that in an elementary or middle school classroom, or even in a professional development workshop, and I say, hey, here's my picture, isn't it great? The third graders are like, that's not your picture. That's Jay's picture. He did that. And I'm like, no, it's my picture. No, it's Jay's. And Jay, of course, is like cowering in the corner. He's not going to tell the teacher. In the middle school classroom, you have to literally walk up to the student and be like, this is my picture. Do you like it? And if I like it, it'll be like, it's not your picture. But that idea that how did you feel when I took something that's yours and said it was mine? And it's a picture. Well, how do you think someone on a website feels when you right click, save picture as, and then use it in your presentation? Then we can get into issues of Creative Commons, like Kelly brought up. Well, there are people that say that's okay, but they want you just to give them credit in the end. So in all due fairness, that's my teacher's painting and that's my painting. But you can do this with kids' paintings too. Oh, you can't see the citation. Shoot, I gotta move this. That's Megan's painting. Okay, that's not my painting. She's much better than I am, clearly. So as we bring all of this together, this personal inquiry that I went on, I reached out to my PLN and they helped me to start to begin to understand. And notice I say start to begin to understand the ethics of digital literacy. And together we found that the context in which we live lead us to develop certain selves that reside within communities, and to really engage in those communities, we have to take stances that lead to participation and agency. And in order to actually participate in those communities, there are certain practices. And each of these domains has ethical context to it. This book is filled with teacher stories about how they do that in their classrooms. And I'm very proud to share their voices with you. We are continuing this inquiry because this is just the surface, and we actually all presented together in November. And at the end of that 75-minute presentation, we basically said we need a second book because we've raised all of these other ethical issues in just thinking about this. We are continuing the inquiry this semester with a series of webinars that are being led by the authors of the chapters. So I invite everyone to continue with us. If you are here in the room tonight and you don't know about the webinars but want to participate, just let me know. I'll send you the Zoom link and you can join in the schedule and you can join in anytime. Also, people who do the series and read the book and do the book study have the opportunity to think about their practice, to be reflective practitioners, and to earn the researcher badge through the Drew Writing Project and Digital Literacies Collaborative. So there's more information on that for everybody. I want to thank you for your participation today. And for those of you online, I want to thank you for being with us. I'm sorry that I couldn't actually talk to you more, but hopefully we will engage a little bit more when I'm hosting the webinars rather than leading one. So I will see you soon, everybody. Thank you.